When I was doing my doctoral work at Duke, it may not be the same now, but there were several areas that you worked in. Hebrew scriptures, New Testament, church history, and then area 4, as we all referred to it, was theology and ethics. It was its own area that, and that categorization really points out the linkage that I've been referring to between what it is that we understand theologically, how we think about God, how we think about our place in the world, and how that translates into our actions. So our ethics flow from our theology, and I suggested that in the last little bit, but you can see how it might work in another place. If your theology is really focused on issues of personal salvation, having to do with salvation into in the afterlife, then your ethic on how you might relate to people in the world now might be very different than someone else's whose theology works in very, very different ways. And those, if you think back to the America's Four Gods, you can think how ethics would work differently based on those four ways of thinking: the distant God, the authoritative God, etc. So there is an intimate connection between theology and ethics, and that is overarching regardless of theological tradition, whether you're Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or pagan or whatever. Your ethics will flow from your theology in different ways. And start here. I'll spin this out in a couple of different ways. But you may remember very early on that one of the critiques and why I chose the Patronus idea was that in my ordination exams, and those of many of my classmates, we made no reference to Kenneth Kirk. Kenneth Kirk was a famous Anglican theologian, ethicist, the early part of the 20th century. And the reason I bring him up now, and I'll refer to him again a little later, is that one of his major works was called The Vision of God. And so I bring that up because Christian ethics, or moral theology as it's also called, is centered, I guess, in what we understand God's vision to be. It's not our vision of God, but what God's vision is for us. And at least as Anglicans, and probably as Christians in general, we would say that God's vision is for a humanity restored and renewed. However you view the theology of the fall, or whatever, yes, we are sinners. Yes, death is in line for all of us, and we are broken in so many ways, not only in terms of our relationship with God, but in terms of our relationship with each other, in terms of our relationship with the wider world. So the vision of God, as Kirk puts it, is that humanity is restored and renewed. And we hear that a lot in our prayers and things like that, and it's certainly part of the catechism, and I'm sure you've heard this before. What is the mission of the church? Here on page 855, the mission of the church is to restore all people in unity in unity with God and each other in Christ. So there is that sense that that is what we are called to do. We are called to help realize God's vision for us. We are called to participate in that mission to restore humanity, renew humanity. And certainly our theology of the incarnation might help inform that Jesus' incarnation is a restoration of humanity, to use the deicist language, that God became human so that humanity might become divine, that we referred to. So it is part of our baptismal covenant, what we do. And so how do we live into that? The fact that we are baptized, our baptismal identity, the fact that we've been marked as Christ's own forever, has consequences. And so what does that mean? How do we live that out? If our ethos, to use the language that I used a little bit ago, if our ethos is God-centered, what ought our ethic be? It's a very different ethos than me-centered, which would imply a different ethic. But if our ethos is God-centered, what would that be? What kind of acts, what ways of living would reflect God's ordering of the world in creation? What acts, what ways of living would reflect God's vision for us as a restored and a renewed humanity? These are some of the questions that theological ethics work on, as opposed to a more general or secular ethics, although certainly they inform them. Those visions of how we think God orders creation would have an impact on questions of beneficence or non-maleficence or justice in biomedical or any other kind of ethic. What is that going to look like? In the next section, I'll turn to Anglican ethics in maybe one or two sections. But I do want to say one thing at this point, is that ethics, there's a distinction between ethics or moral theology and pastoral care. Theological ethics is sort of big picture stuff, abstract, general. This is how we should do things in general. Whereas pastoral care starts from the individual. It starts very specifically, and we weigh the ethics as we work with pastoral care. But there is something a little different than that, and just say a couple words about that now. My dad, I think I mentioned this early on, I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, which was a pacifist church, and that was the tradition that my dad's family came out of. Brethren, Mennonite, not quite Amish, but peace churches. These are people who, if they wanted a deferment from the draft, was basically automatically given to them because of their staunch pacifist stance. World War II, my dad went to fight. One of his brothers couldn't. He was declared 4F, and one of his brothers was a conscientious objector. My dad chose to go. So at some point in my, probably my early teens, when I began to question issues of right and wrong and ethics and all those kinds of things, I said, Dad, you were a pacifist. How could you go? So the ethic there is pacifism, the general. Don't fight. Don't take up arms. And my dad's answer was very short, and I never really explored it after that. He said, Hitler was different. So the ethic may be altered or understood differently when the specific is brought into account. We may not feel, for example, that Christians should take up arms, but some Christians do. So should that have an effect on the pastoral care of those people who do take up arms? There's a difference between the ethic and the pastoral care. They inform one another, but they are not the same.